Title: 1 second later, the train that never stopped. The station breathed like a tired animal, exhaling steam and murmurs and the metallic scent that clung to the rails. Fluorescent lights hummed above, flickering in the corners like weak stars, while the platform swelled with footsteps, rotating wheels, and the low tide of voices that grew and shrank with each announcement overhead. Somewhere beyond the tunnel mouth, air compressed and released in invisible pulses, a pressure that nudged coats and tugged at loose papers, promising arrival without revealing how close it truly was. A clock near the stairwell ticked with the stubborn confidence of machines that don't believe in miracles or mistakes, its second hand sweeping forward with unfeeling grace, unaware that one sweep, one notch, would soon divide 100 private stories into a before and an after. A ripple of expectancy passed along the edge like a hush through tall grass, shoulders angled toward the darkness, shoes adjusted along the yellow line, breath paused at the lip between safety and the clean, hungry cut of the track. Cold air slithered up from the tunnel and met the warm skin of the crowd with a shiver that belonged to both metal and bone. The rails began to sing, a bow drawn slowly across a giant cello, and the platform answered with a vibration you could feel through the soles, a message traveling from a hidden distance to the waiting bodies above. Headlights bloomed at last, a white glare that flattened faces into silhouettes, and the restraining wind arrived a heartbeat later, a hot gust that lifted scarves, worried at newspapers, and sent a candy wrapper sailing like a tiny desperate kite. People leaned in a fraction and then leaned back the same fraction, the choreography learned from years of arrivals and departures, as if everyone had rehearsed the dance without ever meeting. The voice above announced the standard promise: arriving, platform 3, stand clear, mind the gap. The words were so ordinary they were almost invisible, a lacework of repeated sound that could not possibly carry the weight of what approached. The train entered with the muscular thunder of something that believes in momentum more than mercy, its windows strobed with the platform lights, empty seats flickering past like a flipbook of small, passing rooms. Brakes usually begin to whisper first, anyone who waits often learns that gentle prelude, but no whisper came, only the continued insistence of forward motion, the grinding assurance of speed that does not plan to yield. Hands on bags tightened, eyes tracked. The clock's second hand approached its mark and everyone kept believing the next moment would behave like all the others, because that is what moments do, until they don't. A single second arrived and dissolved, too fast to catch, too heavy to forget. The signal lamp that should have held amber for the span of a breath hiccuped and flashed green like a wink from a careless god. And the command chain that should have passed through software and steel to clamp the train's legs shut simply didn't. A thin scream tore loose from somewhere, a warning, an accusation, a prayer, and was swallowed by the iron lung of the tunnel. The train did not slow. It did not bow. It entered the station like a promise broken at the altar, dressed in speed and the certainty that things would continue exactly as they had in the last second, which was now already gone. 1 second later, the world redrew itself with brutal efficiency. Coats snapped backward as the slipstream yanked at fabric, hats fled heads, a glove leaped from fingers, and a newspaper flared open in the air like a panicked bird before shattering into pages that whirled and slapped the tile. The yellow line along the platform, so polite, so theoretical, became a boundary lit by the memory of bright paint and the cold understanding that rules are only as strong as the moment that enforces them. The sound was enormous and absolute, a roar that made thought feel small. The screech arrived late and angry, a grinding, sparking protest that threw orange stars under the carriages, the sound of friction discovering it had overslept. Bodies recoiled, knuckles whitened around metal railings, and 1,000 small balances recalibrated as wobbled suitcases dove toward the edge and were caught by fingers that didn't have time to remember they were brave. Somewhere near the middle of the platform a paper cup toppled and spun without emptying, a foolish little miracle that felt like an insult to fear. Silence fell in chunks, not all at once, first the voices, then the restless shuffle, then even the buzzing lights seemed to dim, as if listening for permission to continue. The unstopped train howled on, finally consenting to slow and uneven jerks that bullied the rails, dragging long squeals from steel as if the track itself had begun to cry. Through the windows flashed the reflections of the platform, a collage of eyes and mouths and lifted hands, brief portraits of astonishment trapped in the moving glass like insects in amber, already fading behind the next streak of light. The platform learned new geometry, where the safe places were, where the emptiness growled, where air pushed and where it pulled. People stepped back in small, guilty hops, measuring the distance to the edge as though the line might suddenly lift and sweep them away like a ribbon caught by wind. Someone's rolling bag escaped its owner and pinballed along the tiles, a clatter that sounded ridiculous beside the train's animal bellow. A shoe, just one, stood neatly near a pillar as if waiting for a foot that had changed its mind. A voice tried to find authority over the loudspeakers and failed, cracking into syllables before clearing its throat and returning with that bland firmness bureaucracies use like a shield. Please stand clear. Please remain calm. Assistance en route. Calm is a fragile word when speed is still visible, when its residue pulls hair and sleeve toward the track like a greedy tide. Yet a strange obedience settled, hands reached without asking for permission. Somebody caught the bag that refused to stop, a shoulder turned into a barrier for a smaller body. A child's cry knifed through the dense air, bright and high and pure, the ancient signal that resets all priorities. That sound traveled faster than reason. Faces pivoted toward it and then toward the edge, scanning for a worst that could still be prevented. A belt loop snagged on a railing and refused to tear, a scarf's fringe caught on a boot heel and untied fear, a wrist slid free from a careless grasp only to be trapped again by strangers who did not yet know they would remember this touch for years. The train crawled now, humbled by its own weight, and finally stopped beyond the far end of the platform where only service doors and warning signs lived. The aftersound, the slow, exhausted metallic breathing, settled over everyone like dust. For a moment, nothing dared move. Even the clock seemed to hesitate before accepting that its hand had to tick again, because clocks are loyal, and time, faithless as it can be, still has a schedule. Phones lifted, some by reflex, some by duty, some by a need to invent sense with pixels. Screens framed the edges that had gone soft in shock and tried to make them straight again. Footage began to exist that would outlive the tremble in the hands that captured it, videos that would be played and paused and argued over by people who had not felt the heat of the passing carriages on their faces. Someone pressed call, someone pressed record, someone pressed both and looked like they needed a third button labeled undo. The objects of the almost, a dented thermos, an open wallet, a scarf that had learned to fly, became anchors around which stories would later form. That wallet would be remembered as proof of luck, the scarf as a joke that mercifully arrived on time, the thermos as the thing that thudded when everything else swam. In a disaster that did not quite happen, trivia becomes holy. Ordinary things volunteer to be talismans because people need something to hold. Inside the stopped cars, faces finally appeared, pale behind glass, blinking with the startled look of passengers who had just been yanked from sleep into a room where everyone was already arguing. Palms touched windows in the tentative way of people who are not sure whether the barrier is for protection or punishment. A few seats away, someone covered their mouth with both hands and didn't remove them until the reflection stared back like a stranger. The first shouts of instruction pierced the hush, vests in bright colors moving like flags across a battlefield created by physics and a tired mistake. Arms windmilled, doors were pried, and a ladder materialized from nowhere like a conjurer's scarf, bridging glass to platform in the universal gesture that says, "Here is a way back to ground." Feet hesitated at the threshold and then committed. Gravity welcomed each decision with a nod. Explanations, like smoke, curled from every corner, a malfunctioning sensor, a late software patch, a test that overrode a break handshake for the length of one breath. Each version began with certainty and ended with a question mark that shrank into the collar of the speaker when examined too closely. A green light was involved, everyone agreed, a green that should have been amber, an amber that should have lasted, a sequence that should have held together like a zipper and instead spat the tooth of error into the gears. The clock said it had been a minute. Bodies said it had been an hour. Hearts argued for an eternity compressed into a single pressed flower of time. 1 second later became a phrase spoken softly at first, then louder, as if naming the rift could help stitch it. That second was replayed in eyes. The flicker, the wind, the knot break, replayed until it grew teeth and then, mercifully, began to wear down at the edges, the way sharp stones do in a strong river. 2 attendants moved along the platform with the gentle authority of people who have learned they are always arriving after and must still make before feel possible again. They asked small, human questions whose answers restore reality. Are you steady? Is this yours? Will you sit? because the grand ones have no handles in the minute just after fear. A bottle of water changed hands with solemnity. Gratitude nodded back like a candle flame. Near the stairwell, a small circle formed around the place where a suitcase had kissed the yellow paint and been persuaded to reconsider. The group admired the scuffed wheel as if it were a hero who had survived something noble. Jokes attempted to stand on their wobbly feet and fell twice before one finally grew strong enough to be shared, and laughter, when it finally arrived, did so the way rain sometimes returns after a storm, tentative, testing the ground before committing to a shine. From the glass office that overlooked the tracks, a figure watched the slow choreography with a posture that had learned weight in one instant. Every lever and indicator behind that glass now felt like a confession. A phone pressed to an ear received words with no room for disagreement, and yet a free hand rested against the window as if touch might convince the scene to be kinder. Responsibility is a coat that fits all sizes, and on days like this it wears everyone at once. Maintenance workers appeared with tools that looked both delicate and brutal, instruments intended to measure, prod, and compel the truth from silent metal. A panel was opened near the signal light, and behind it lay the nervous system of the station, wires in ordered colors like veins braided into a promise. A connector was reseated with a click that sounded too small to be the hinge on which 100 lives had almost swung. In the fussing of repair and the ritual of report writing, it would be noted that a buffer duration had been shortened during an overnight test, by 1 second for diagnostic purposes, and never restored, because someone had planned to, because someone had been careful, because care is a tower of many carefuls and one missing brick is enough for wind to find. The sentence would include the phrase "no injuries," and relief would dress those words in silk, while the naked truth, "this could have been worse," would stand in the doorway, refusing to leave. Far from the platform, in kitchens and offices, the story began to spread with the reckless generosity of rumor. The version about the hero who dragged someone back by the hood, the version about the driver who laid on the horn like a warning from the future, the version about the light that blinked the wrong language. Each teller added a handful of salt, a squeeze of lemon, a drop of flame, because stories, like wounds, always beg to be cleaned and cauterized. On the platform itself, the smell of hot steel started to cool, replaced by the ministering scents of coffee and antiseptic wipes and the stubborn human fragrance of sweat that says, "We stayed, we helped, we were here." Someone passed a box of biscuits with the ceremonial gravity of communion. Someone else tucked a blanket around shoulders that were too proud to ask but grateful to accept. The smallest acts grew tall in the long shadow of what had almost been. The train, chastened, was inched back like an animal led by a rope, each wheel finding its apology against the track. When it came level with the center of the platform, doors sighed open in unison and the station exhaled with them. There is a relief that only doors can provide, a lesson that the world still contains hinges. The dismount was slower this time, feet treating ground as if it were a privilege granted by negotiation. Questions sought a place to sleep and found only restless cots. Should the schedules change? Should the software be shamed? Should yellow paint become a wall instead of a warning? Engineers and officials and commuters and the mere curious tried on the future like a coat in a mirror. Does this keep me warm? Does this make me safe? Can I still move my arms? No one agreed, not yet, but the trying itself warmed them. Evening thinned toward night, and the station's voice softened. Shadows gathered in corners where laughter had recently perched. A broom whispered along the tiles, convincing debris to forget that it had once been excitement. The clock, indifferent as always, confessed the hour in neat ticks, and the second hand, the traitor, the witness, the only honest thing, continued to draw its slim circle without apology. The platform emptied by degrees, a tide that left behind only a damp shine and a few memorials to a near miss, a scuffed wheel, a flattened bottle cap, a single mitten that looked oddly confident about being found. Down in the tunnel, cool air reclaimed the path, a river returning to its bed after a boulder rolls through and then moves on. The rails were quiet now, but the quiet felt like listening, like a child in trouble who has learned how to be still. Night custodians arrived with their quiet expertise, people who speak fluently with spaces after they have been loud. Tape marked a rectangle where measurements had been taken and then taken again, sober geometry that turned emotion into data so that tomorrow could be argued with. A man with a clipboard squinted at figures that knew nothing of wind or fear, and yet the figures would be asked to prevent both. Close by the signal light, a tiny sticker was applied, bright and almost cheerful: buffer lock, do not edit without second sign OFF. The bureaucracy of safety, with its stamps and counter-signatures, is not poetry, but sometimes it saves lives more gracefully than a ballad. Beside the sticker, a small, hand-scrawled note appeared later: hold the amber like a promise. Not official, not required, but human in a way systems can't be. Morning sent its gray scouts ahead, softening the signs and washing the tiles in a color between apology and hope. Commuters returned like migrating birds, drawn by obligation and the certainty that things go on. That is the cruel blessing of cities, the noble stubbornness of the working day. They glanced at the rails the way one glances at a scar, curious, respectful, eager to look away and glad to still have skin to look at. The story was retold in yawns and sips between stops, compressed into a handful of sentences that ended with a shake of the head and an exhale that tried to be a joke and failed. Someone pointed at the sticker by the light, and someone else nodded as if the sticker were a saint's relic, something to touch before crossing a busy street. The platform reclaimed its small habits. Pigeons returned to their consultations. The candy wrapper, now tamed, lay folded in a pocket. Later that day, the train arrived and performed the modest miracle it had once forgotten. It slowed, it sang the gentle prelude of brakes, it settled, it opened, it waited. The sound was not sweet to anyone who had been there the day before, but it was acceptable, and in the economy of fear, acceptable as well. Passengers disembarked with that mild arrogance of people whose feet are on the ground again, and no one apologized to gravity for using it so roughly. In the calm that followed, a few stayed behind and looked down the tunnel with a quiet that was less about reverence than about calculation. The human brain is a mathematician of risk, always converting memory into caution, caution into ritual. One by one they stepped toward the yellow line just enough to feel the wind and then stepped back as if touching a hot pan, reminding themselves that danger can be admired from an inch further away. Work orders traveled the length of the system like small trains of their own, carrying instructions and approvals and the signatures of people who would never meet. Somewhere in an office where the light was always too blue, a patch was pushed, a checkbox ticked, a log annotated with the unromantic heroism of a timestamp. The fix would propagate through code and cable until it lived in the fingers of brakes and the breath of sensors, a prayer translated into the language of circuits. There were still arguments, of course, over budgets, over blame, over the proper thickness of yellow paint, and those arguments would continue because they are the immune system of shared life. But something softer also took root: the instinct to pull a stranger back from a foolish edge, the habit of holding a bag closer to the body during a rush, the willingness to let a joke fail twice before laughing. Small civics for a crowded world. Time, charmed only by itself, kept on. People who had been there told people who had not, and the telling thinned into a story, and the story into an anecdote, and the anecdote into a shrug that still carried a tremor you could hear if you leaned close. 1 second later, someone would say at a party or a queue or a kitchen table, and everyone would nod, each privately translating that phrase into their own near miss, their own amber that held. The platform, for all its history and the weight of yesterday's almost, learned to be ordinary again, because ordinary is the bravest costume a place can wear after it has flirted with catastrophe. The clock resumed being a tool instead of a judge, the loudspeaker went back to being a bore, the rails, when they sang, did so in the key of routine: we come, we go, we stop, we carry you, we try. And yet, if you stood very still when the tunnel exhaled and the first breath of the arriving wind found your face, you could feel the ghost of that second, thin as thread, strong as wire, stringing the present to the past. It asked for nothing, demanded no shrine, but it hummed with a lesson that the body doesn't forget. The world is a handshake between intention and accident, and the promise we make to one another is to keep our fingers interlaced. By evening, the sticker by the signal had collected a fingerprint smudge and a tiny nick from an impatient toolbox, signs not of neglect but of use. The promise was being touched, enforced, maintained. The amber held. The light glowed like patience in a crowded room. The trains came and did what trains are supposed to do. They yielded to the idea that stopping is part of going. Long after, on some future day that would not remember to be special, a breeze would lift a page from a book on a commuter's lap and the page would flutter closed just as the train began to slow. The coincidence would be small and perfect and belong to no one. In that modest poetry lay the true memorial, everyday safety, the quiet choreography of systems and strangers agreeing to share a narrow edge without pushing one another off it. And if you listened then, when the doors sighed and feet found ground, you would hear it again, not loud, not scolding, just factual as weather, 1 second later. Not a threat, not a prophecy, simply the measurement of how close we live to the hinge on which the day swings. The train that once refused to stop now paused with practiced grace, and the people it carried stepped into their hours as if stepping onto a bridge they had built together. The station kept breathing, as stations do, exhaling steam and murmurs into nights and mornings without counting them, welcoming tired faces and urgent feet and the endless relay of arrivals that make a city a city. Under the clock that had never apologized, a pair of strangers sidestepped each other and shared a quick, shy smile, the sort of exchange that proves civilization is not an idea but a habit. Above them, the signal held its amber like a steady heart, and the rails, remembering, sang softly of